It is the year 2021, and I'm filming this with a $1,000 iPhone 10. In my hand over here, I have a Bell & Howell regular 8mm movie camera, which still works, first of all. It's mechanical, so I just got to wind it up a little bit. And when I press the button, purrs like a kitten. Interesting, isn't it? 70-year-old piece of technology can still do all of the functions that it was designed to do. I think that's pretty impressive. Here I have some relatively new Kodak film stock, and this is 16mm. This will work in a 16mm camera. This is a double 8mm camera, so even though they're related to each other, I would have to actually take this film and punch some holes in it in order for me to be able to use it in this camera and spool it down to a smaller reel size. But if Kodak continues making this, I can conceivably still use this camera if I have a hole punching machine that I can operate in the dark, which some people out there do. So that is why I can still use this camera. Now, once Kodak stops making 16mm film, I will have another problem. But anyway, let's discuss this a step at a time here. I want to discuss what, how much longer can we enjoy shooting on film for. First, I'll give you a little background on myself. I started shooting film in the 1990s when I was a kid. I refused to shoot on video. I would be walking around with an ISO Super 8 camera and people would be like, "Oh, did you hear about video? Why aren't you using that?" And I was like, "Sorry, I heard the message and I'm not interested. I want to be able to shoot on an organic medium that has, that organic look." And your VHS at its 60 fields per second, limited resolution, over sharpened nonsense image is just not interesting to me, even though it's just $5 for a 2-hour tape. The cameras weren't cheap, by the way, but that's another story. So that was my attitude always. I always was a film nut. But let's be honest, back when I was filming, there was no HD. And I went from Super 8 to 16mm, from 16mm to 35mm when I was doing my first feature film. So I've shot a lot of film. And I got it under my fingernails, as they say, the emulsion, right? So I know quite a bit about film. And, I started shooting HD after a while because I'm sorry, I don't have the money to, indulge in this. If I can get good image quality on digital and kind of stylize it to look like film, I'm happy. That's good enough to tell a story. But I still find myself drawn to film as a technical medium and creatively as well. So let's consider now the entire chain of things that are involved in film technology. So the first is we have is, the optics, right? The optics are the same no matter whether it's a digital camera or a film camera. It could care less. You could, if you have the right lens mount, you could take these lenses and mount them on a digital camera. It'll be just fine. And so optics are always going to be available, not an issue at all. Any kind of imaging system has to have optics in it. So we're not going to ever worry about lenses going extinct, I'm pretty sure. The next step is the camera. Now here we have a camera that's over 70 years old and it still works because it's a mechanical device. It's made of pretty much all metal parts as far as I figure with something like this. There are cameras that use electronic components to them for electric motors and stuff, and sometimes those do go bad, but they're not difficult to fix from like an engineering standpoint. So you can actually even design, I'm pretty sure, a film camera and print one with the 3D printer. I've never really seen it done with a motion picture camera, but I've seen it done enough with still cameras and other devices that require gears and so on and so forth. So it's very possible that at one point someone's going to come up with a 3D printed movie camera, be it a 16mm or whatever. It's probably within the realm of possibility to get that done. Nowadays, we don't really project our film anymore. We scan it, and scanners are basically very similar to cameras mechanically. The only difference is that you have to have an imaging chip to scan the actual image, and that is something that is very widely and easily available and will be going into the future, because if we're working on electrical imagery, you have to have an imaging chip. No other way around that one. So that's not going to go extinct. And basically what remains is the actual film itself, this stuff, and the processing chemistry. Now the processing chemistry, those of you who've developed your own film, especially if you've done your own black and white, it's not rocket science. You can, as long as you can get access to those chemicals, which I believe you pretty much can, you can get film developed. Even if, let's say, Kodak were to shut down, you can, the formulas are all public, you can get all the chemistry together and you can develop film. So that's not an obstacle. Even with color, which is more involved, it's doable, even though it might be a little bit expensive, but you can do it. The one thing that is practically impossible for somebody to kind of do in their own backyard or in their own garage is to make this stuff here. And the reason why is because this is a very intense process. It has very tight tolerances. It is difficult to execute. There's a great YouTube video by Ilford that shows how they actually make film, which is very interesting. And it all has to be done in the dark. I don't see a time when we're going to be able to do something like that in our own backyard. It's not something I can see happening unless there was some major change in technology that came about. So the weakest link in the chain is always going to be this stuff over here. And this is also the most expensive part of the process as well, which is, so this influences the most whether film is going to be used or not. Because face it, this is the imaging medium. It's the actual celluloid. This is what creates the image. This is just a box that pulls this stuff through. That's basically all it does. In an intermittent motion like it's supposed to and all that stuff. So that's the big question, is when this stuff is going to disappear, this is going to be a paperweight, right? So let's think further about who's going to use these cameras and for what. Let's pretend that it's the mid-1990s. You're a filmmaker, you want to shoot something really bad, but money as usual is an object. So what options do you really have? Well, if money is really an object, the only real option you have is to film in the format that I'm being filmed in right now, and that's high-8 video. Okay, there's a little bit of banding here on this camera because it doesn't, it has some shielding issues with the cabling. But more or less, this is the image quality that you can expect in high-8 video. Now let's fast forward 20 years, and this is being filmed with a iPhone camera. I kept it at 60, so the frame rate's the same, so the motion is comparable. And I would say it's quite an improvement in quality. The big question now is, will there still be people shooting film in the future, and why are they going to do that? Now here's an app called 8mm on my iPhone, and it's supposed to make this look like Super 8. And you can go through different little, filters on it. You can, obviously the scratches and the grain are there, but honestly, some of it looks pretty fake. Those of you who know film well will know the fake grain and the fake, scratches from the real thing. And that kind of leads me to my point where, here's all these different filters you can do and stuff like that. That leads me kind of to my point, is that you're going to always have those people who are going to insist that the only way to get the film look is to shoot on film. And I understand those people, because as a creative individual, I know when something's just a little bit off, It's one of those things you make a fuss about. And the funny thing is that sometimes you'll show that to somebody else and they'll say, well, I don't see what the difference is. And you'll be like, no, it's wrong. So that creative argument always exists. And people are going to want to use it for that reason. And somebody like Quentin Tarantino, for example, who shoots on 35 and 65mm, insists that they can still really tell the difference. And some other people can't, So that's the whole thing. So there are going to be still enough people that are going to insist that the only way to get it right is to actually shoot it. And that is one group of people. And then there's another group of people that will enjoy the mechanical process of shooting on film. So that means using cameras like this and dealing with the whole, threading the film through and, having this cool looking thing on the set and all of that stuff. So there are people who think that's cool, and they're going to still be around, I'm sure. It's a whole experience that they're after. So I actually probably fall into the latter category, because what you're looking at right now, to me, it's not exactly film, but if you keep tweaking it, I'm sure I can get it pretty close. So that's just my point of view. You don't have to agree with me if you don't want. So as long as that group of the people who want the exact look and the people who enjoy the experience of the technology remain around, there will still be a market demand of some kind for film. Now, how big is that demand going to be in the grand scheme of things? Well, right now it's already pretty small. But if you go on YouTube, you still see enough people shooting on Super 8 and 16 millimeter and paying insane amounts of money to get it transferred to digital. So it's there. And as long as it's there, there will be people that are going to be interested in servicing that market, including, of course, the filmmakers. We've considered the demand side of the equation, that is, who wants to buy this stuff. And that's the most critical thing from a business perspective. Without a market, what's the point of making this? But at the same time, it would be a little bit of an omission to consider what actually goes into making this, and we've already started talking about that. Why is film so difficult to make? It's something that needs to be done to very tight tolerances, and it has to be done in the dark. And then the film also has to be stored properly, so it will not only not be fogged by light, but also humidity conditions have to be controlled, temperature has to be controlled, and even things like cosmic radiation. Sounds weird, but actually that's true. Leave film around long enough and rays, all these weird cosmic rays from the sun actually can come and damage the film, interestingly. So because of that, this is very difficult stuff to make. And one factor you have to consider is the sheer human knowledge that goes into making this stuff. It's not just a formula that anybody could just go and reproduce on their own, unlike the processing chemistry, and even unlike the camera design, which may have its fine points, but generally speaking, if you got an exact copy of a camera, you could reproduce it. Not so with film. It would take a lot of more work to try to reverse engineer film, and one of the critical criteria here is the passing on of the knowledge of how this is made from generation of engineers to generation. And that's extremely important. If that is ever disrupted, if, let's say, for example, Eastman Kodak did go bankrupt, sent all of its engineers home, and those engineers, moved away or got old and died or whatever, if you wanted to resurrect this format, that would be very, very difficult. You couldn't just take a little plan and, a little schematic and try to build it yourself. This is a much more involved process. So because of that, film is a very fragile medium. If it ever had a very serious discontinuance in its manufacture, you may never be able to get it going again, unless there was tremendous commercial demand for it, which is extremely unlikely in this day, and you would be able to get that investment capital back into hiring engineers and trying to get them to figure out how to get this stuff to properly be manufactured again. So handle with care is the critical word with film here. The other problem is that since this is a chemical process, it also impacts the environment, and we are living in an environmentally conscious age where there is always legislation being passed that restricts the use of certain chemicals and certain chemical processes, and that is only getting stricter as time goes by. So because of that, Kodak has already in the past had to have discontinued certain films. Those of you who remember magnetic striped film that was used in Super 8 and in 16 millimeter, well, that's a thing of the past now because the process for doing that was not environmentally friendly, and Kodak was already facing very poor demand in those product lines anyway, so instead of redoing it, they just said, screw it, we don't need it anymore, and they discontinued it. One line of Vectrochrome film was also discontinued for that reason. Vectrochrome is still around, but in a different formulation. Certain black and white reversal films were reformulated because they used a chemical known as potassium dichromate in the bleach, which was also very environmentally unfriendly. So there is this constant reorientation of film design to meet new environmental standards, and those environmental standards in turn are getting stricter as time goes by. And more and more countries are also adopting those rules. So because of that, you can't just exactly move your manufacturer to another country. Eventually, the laws are going to catch up to you. So these are the challenges, the very detailed engineering knowledge that goes into making film that cannot be just simplified to a schematic, and the very involved issues with environmental impact and all of that. So those are going to be complicating factors for film going forward without question. Now, it would be interesting if somebody could develop a technology that simplified the manufacture of film, but that would really require a tremendous capital investment into research and development. And unless somebody came up with a process that was applicable to another more profitable, venture that could then be repurposed for film manufacture, unless that happened, I don't think you're going to see something like that really happen, right? So that's basically where we're at right now. And again, the demand is what keeps pushing this product. The supply is constrained by technical matters and environmental matters. So that's kind of what film is facing as far as its continued existence is concerned. Where that's going to end up landing us, we have no idea. It's possible at a certain point that the big behemoth film directors like Scorsese and Tarantino that are keeping Kodak basically alive, their motion picture division anyway, alive and producing film, may run out of steam at some point. These guys are going to die at some point. The next generation may simply not care enough about film to keep it alive. But what's interesting to note is, let's get back to the example I made about the double 8mm camera and the 16mm film. This film, even though you couldn't directly use it in this camera, you can punch the right holes in it, of course in the dark, and get it to work in this camera. Well, you can do the same thing with 35mm film. You can cut it down to, the size that this camera needs. And as long as you have some form of celluloid film being used in the world, that film can be cut to the right size. There was a company, Pro 8mm, it's still around, and before Kodak started making color negative film in Super 8, they actually started to cut down 35mm film into Super 8 size and put it into cartridges and sell it at an outrageously high price, but it was still available. If you wanted to shoot color negative in Super 8, you could go to Pro 8mm and buy their color negative cut film. Now that Kodak makes it pre-cut is, makes it much less expensive, but hey, if you think film is really worth it for you, that you may be willing to pay that price. So for example, if people are still shooting film in 20 or 30 years from now, and they're primarily shooting it for still photography, which would be 35mm and 2¼ and stuff like that. The film is made in very large sizes, so if you could convince the manufacturer, and people have done this in the past, to make, give you that bulk size, and you would cut it down yourself as a, some little cottage industry company, you could do that. That would work. So you could theoretically get film to be available for cameras like this, even if it wasn't directly made like that by the manufacturer, because the hardest part of making film is getting that celluloid coated with the silver. Once that's done, cutting it is, as long as you could do it in the dark and you could do it accurately, which again, the technology for that is pretty simple and straightforward, you could still keep making film. So the only time film in that case would be extinct is if nobody wants to use it anymore, or not enough people want to use it anymore that justify keeping companies like Kodak working. Granted, there are some other companies that are not in Kodak's realm. You have some companies in Eastern Europe that have made film for many, many years, and it may be possible to continue making film there as compared to the United States. And that may be kind of film's last hurrah, are these Eastern European companies that, the former Soviet bloc countries that may be able to, with lower labor costs and maybe slightly, looser environmental regulations, may be able to continue making film for some time. But again, it's all market dependent, and who knows, we may be seeing a couple of backs and forths going on. But again, since film is a fragile medium, once enough people stop making it, that cumulative engineering knowledge of how to make film economically enough for it to be economically viable, that is, will be in danger of being lost. And that's the biggest risk film has. So if you really want to keep film alive, you better make sure it stays alive, because you can't just resuscitate it from zero centuries later. That would be very expensive. Although who knows what technology will be available then. We can only guess, right? So that's it. That's all I wanted to say. A bit long, but a very comprehensive overview of what it would take to keep film going, if that's important to you. Personally, for me, it's interesting. I'm not so sure, though, that I would want to spend about $50,000 on shooting a feature film on 16mm. Yeah, unless I won the lottery or something, and I don't play the lottery. So there you go. Anyway, have a great day, everybody. And if you have your opinions, please let me know. I'd be very interested in having a discussion.